Wonderful. So thank you so much for joining this morning. Again, just a reminder, you have your globe symbol at the bottom right of your screen, and you can switch into the Arabic channel or stay in the English channel, however you prefer. And please, throughout the presentation, feel free to write any questions you might have into the Q&A box, and I'll get to it at the end of the presentation. So today we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is understanding children's brain development. I love talking about neuroscience. I will try to keep it short and concise for you, but again, please feel free to write any questions down into the Q&A box. So what we're going to cover today is the different stages of brain development in children. We're going to go through the cognitive development of the brain and the emotional development of the brain. And of course, we're going to talk about the differences between the two and how we can support our children throughout and how we can nurture brain development in all the different stages. Before I go ahead, let me just introduce myself. My name is Tash Enriquez. I'm the founder and director of Created Coaching. I hold a postgrad degree in sport and exercise science and medicine. I actually did quite a bit of research myself when it comes to neuroscience and the effects of training, exercise, nutrition, and mindfulness interventions on the brain. I am an ICF certified life coach. I practice horse-guided empowerment, which is basically horse-assisted coaching, and I have a few other degrees. What I'm passionate is about providing knowledge and education for improved physical and mental health and well-being. Okay, so let's dive right into it. Different stages of brain development. Okay, so here we have quite a few things, so just stay with me as I'm taking you through, and we're going to start at the brain stem. So the brain stem helps us to feel emotionally and physically safe. And this part is very important because it's one of our most it's one of our most immature and one of our most primitive areas of the brain stem. So this one develops from birth, it's right there. And this also gives you an indicator of what little children, little babies need from birth, is feeling emotionally and physically safe. Whenever we are frightened or stressed, the brain goes into survival mode, the brain stem function, and the brain can't actually grow and develop. So avoiding that kind of stress for infants is very, very important. And then we go to the cerebellum, right over here, that orange area, darker orange area, from the birth to 1 year. And this is where our children want to move a lot. They want to be able to just express themselves through movement, and allowing that movement to happen encourages brain development and encourages brain growth in that time. Now, when I say in that time, it's actually something that different children are more susceptible to throughout their childhood. So you might always find children and adults, by the way, that learn much better when we give them the freedom to move and to be physically active. Then we go into that green area here, the visual processing in the occipital lobe. This is an area that is most developed from birth to 2 years. So here we want to provide lots of interesting things to look at. We want to allow our children to just have that visual input. And then we go into language and touch. So this is, oops, sorry. That's my mouse. This is the parietal lobe from birth to 6 years. So quite a long period of time here. And this is all about the physical touch, the holding, the hugging, holding the hand, giving gentle massages, but also allowing lots of objects to manipulate. So this is important to keep in mind already, because quite often as parents, we would like our children to just look rather than always touching. So you might know, or you might have observed how your little children like to touch everything. Yeah, and it's an important part for their brain to process that new information. So of course, only if it's safe, but there is benefits in allowing your child to touch everything, to manipulate everything that they are getting to explore. And there is that stage where that also means putting it into their mouth. So tasting it as well. So it's the whole kinesthetic experience that children are getting. And then also here, the language development. So we're still in that blue area here. And here is where we want to talk to the children as much as possible, singing, reading, listen, responding, and reading the same stories over and over again. So that's how children actually memorize. So don't be worried to having lesser books that you read over and over again. Of course, we want to have some variety because we want to provide different vocabulary, but there is nothing wrong in the repetition of sharing stories over and over again. And then we move into that red area here, the frontal lobe. So here we have the concrete thinking, which starts from 3 to 12 years. So here we're starting to categorize objects. Here we're starting to explore problem solving. It can be frustrating for children at that age not to figure something out, but it is important that we assist, but not take over. So sometimes it can be challenging for parents to, just letting the child unfold in their development, in learning new tasks. But of course, we know it is part of the natural development and children do need that. Now, still within that red area is something that I'm going to be talking about much more detailed later on, the prefrontal cortex, judgment. So this is from 12 until 22 years. Okay, now the prefrontal cortex, when we talk about judgment, this is about critical decision making and risk taking as well. So this area is so important because it is basically the opponent to the brainstem. So whenever we are frightened or stressed, when we're in survival mode, the brainstem will take over. So here we do not take rational decisions because, everything is overwritten by that idea of us being in danger. And on top of that, the prefrontal cortex really only develops between 12 and 22 years. So again, we're going to talk about that in more detail later, but just for now, try to keep that in mind, how these two parts of the brain are, opposing each other. Okay, so here we have a few interesting facts, and I'm going to start up here. So first of all, we're talking about learning for life in the 21st century. Why in the 21st century? Well, if we think about it, what we are exposed to now as adults, but even more so as young children, is completely different to what we were exposed to 50 years ago even. So now there's a lot of influences that even as parents are quite new for us to consider. There's a lot of decisions that we have to make as parents that are new decisions, and no one can really take that from us. No one can really support us. When is the right time to provide your child with a mobile phone, for example? When is the right time to introduce all different types of electronics and technology into your child's life? And there's no right or wrong answer, but we want to be mindful and we want to have some sort of education around the brain development in order to make a well-educated decision on these different choices. So 80% of the brain development, sorry, my mouse disappeared. 80% of brain development happens before a child turns 3. That's the fastest rate of brain development that we will experience in our whole life. Numeracy and literacy. Children start building the foundational skills for communicating, counting, reading, and writing very early. And early learning builds their vocabulary and their ability to tell stories. So reading to our children way before we get any response from them and we might believe that they're able to take up all that information is so important to really encourage their literacy. And also when we want to build multiple languages, exposing them to hearing these different languages is very, very important from birth, basically. Between 3 and 5, children's brains are primed to learn the skills that are foundation of critical thinking and emotional maturity. So remember, we were saying that the prefrontal cortex only starts developing from the age of 12. And again, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for decision making, but also for emotion regulation and emotional maturity. with that being said, we do need to provide the foundation between the ages of 3 and 5. And I come back to that later on and how we can do that and how we can support our children in doing that. So we cannot now say, okay, the prefrontal cortex is not developed. I leave that part, that emotional development part out until my child reaches that stage. Children grow stronger and boost their spatial awareness as they build their skills to balance, climb, run, dance, and hold a pencil. And young children learn better when they are moving. So I also mentioned that before, allowing your child to move is important. Personally, I grew up in the 80s where, you know, we were told as children to sit still in order to learn. Fortunately, now in schools, we're much more aware of the need for children to move. And again, that might carry all the way through adulthood. So even for yourself, you might want to consider if you are actually learning better when you're moving and when you're physically active. I know for me, it is definitely the case. And movement is now something that I include into learning. Children from advantaged families hear 30 million more words by the time they are 3 years old. Now, in this study from 1995, advantaged means having more access to books, having more access to information, and education of the parents as well. Now, we don't really need to be too fussed about the word advantaged here, but I think what's important is just going back to reading, going back to exposing the children to all that kind of information, to all the words, to all the languages that we can in a household. Children who are struggling with reading and writing or talking and building relationships can be provided with support earlier if recognized by a parent or an early childhood teacher, which is quite logical, isn't it? But the reason I put it in here is because we do want to be mindful of our children's challenges. And that doesn't mean that they fall into a certain category. That doesn't mean that they have a learning disability just yet. That doesn't mean that, you know, anything is remotely wrong with them. It just means to acknowledge where your child is and where they might be able to go when supported differently. And every child learns in a different way. So on that first slide, when we're looking at the different brain areas, all the years that are given here are just indicators. They're just benchmarks, they're averages. That does not mean that your child might just be very talented in one area and slightly delayed in other areas, which then means they can still learn, they just might want to learn a bit differently. So it's having that awareness over how you can support your child. And now the last one, and this is my favorite one, 1 million neural connections are formed every second in the first few years of life. So just let that sink in for a moment. 1 million connections every second. So your child in the first few years of life just develops their brain at an amazing pace that we can't even fully comprehend, right? I can't comprehend that number. And every neural connection then forms what will become the subconscious brain. So every time a new neural connection is formed and used and reused, your brain will decide to move it into the subconscious mind. So that happens, for example, with movements such as walking. When your child first learns how to walk, it is an absolute conscious task. Because it is new, your brain has to think about every single part of the movements that together form the big movement of walking. But of course, now as you're walking, you're not thinking about that. So these neural connections that make up walking have now moved into the subconscious mind. And the same with reading, the same with speech. You know, we don't think about how do I need to create the sound for the letter A. You just speak and the word comes out. You think and the word comes out. Good. Diving deeper into cognitive brain development. So an interesting concept is the 4 stages developed by Jean Piaget, a psychologist who really dove deep into children's brain development. And the background and the key concepts of his 4 stages, which we're going to discuss on the next slide, are that a child's intelligence changes as children grow. So it doesn't mean that their intelligence increases. It just means the intelligence changes. And also important that children don't just acquire knowledge, they must actually construct a mental model of the world through experience. So remember that first slide, we were talking about how first we want to feel safe and secure, but then we want to see, and then we want to touch and explore through that. So all these stages are very important to construct that mental model of the world. Because if we don't go through that stage, you could only be told how something looks, but you wouldn't really understand it because you haven't seen it. So if someone tells you now about, let's say, an animal that you haven't seen, an exotic animal, they will give you examples on how it looks similar to something else. They will give you a color that you have already seen. They might give you a sound that is a comparison to something else. And through that, you're going to construct a mental model of this new animal that you've never seen a picture of. And you will already have an expectation. You will already have an understanding. You might be off slightly, but you were able to use your existing ideas and concepts to acquire a new concept. Now, children can't do that because they haven't seen that much. Yeah, so they must actually slowly develop and explore all the different things. Children's intelligence differs from an adult's in quality rather than in quantity. So again, the intelligence changes. It doesn't mean that we don't have the same kind of intelligence. Yeah, and of course that means that children reason differently from adults and see the world in different ways. And you might see that with your young children, and when you have toddlers, it's just beautiful how you can understand their reasoning sometimes. They might be slightly wrong, but you can see how their rationale actually makes total sense from where they are and from their level of intelligence. Children actively build up their knowledge about the world. So they are not just sitting there waiting to have their heads filled with knowledge. Yeah, they are doing it in an active way. Again, they need to explore, they need to develop. And the sequence of the 4 stages on the next slide is universal across cultures and follows the same invariable order. So coming into the 4 stages. So from 0 to 2, we have the sensory motor stage. And again, if you're thinking back to the first slide, you'll understand how that comes. So exploring the world through senses and actions. Yeah, looking, hearing, touching, mouthing, grasping is all super, super important. What we can witness as parents in that stage is object permanence starts to occur. So in the very early baby stage, in the very early infant stage, the moment you leave the room, your child doesn't any longer know that you exist. Okay, and in these first 2 years, the child then moves into the different stage, which we call object permanence, where the child is very well aware that just because you're not there, you still exist. Stranger anxiety. So this comes with the comfort and security. The less we know, the less we know about the world, the easier it is for us to get scared. Then we're moving into pre-operational stage, which is from 2 to 7. And again, please keep in mind, as we're going through it, feel free to compare your child towards these models. They're all just models, right? So your child might be in a different stage, even so their ages are slightly different. So in the pre-operational stage, we represent and refer to objects and events with words or images. We use intuitive rather than logical reasoning. And I come back to that in a second because it's an important point. We believe inanimate objects possess human feelings and emotions. So here we practice pretend play and egocentrism. Egocentrism is not a negative thing here. Egocentrism in this way actually means that a child is aware that they are an individual, that they have feelings, emotions, that they have their own will, that they know what they want. So it's a good thing. It's very important to have this kind of egocentrism. So again, for parents, it's important to keep in mind that when your child in that age often talks in a way where they come from, I want, do this. It's a healthy expression of their own will. Of course, we do want to teach them to say it in a more polite way, but it is important. So using intuitive rather than logical reasoning. Let's think about that for a moment, because that's actually the beauty of toddlers, right? That they have that very intuitive way of seeing the world and making their own conclusions. The logical reasoning comes in a little bit later, and that's where it is easier for children to see sequences. So in this first stage, in the second stage, sorry, the pre-operational stage, they can understand sequences, but short sequences. So that's where they're still depending heavily on their intuition. And then as we move into the concrete operational stage between 7 and 11 years, so here we can conserve, reverse, they're thinking, they can classify objects, think logically and understand analogies, but only about concrete events. So here they're still depending on actually witnessing the events, being aware of the events, seeing something. Yeah. And here in this development, we have conservatism, we have mathematical transformation. So a lot of children in this stage really, really love logic. They love reason. Everything has to make sense to them. And again, different children will go differently into these different stages. But here, and the reason why I find this quite important is if you have siblings that are in the pre-operational and in the concrete operational stages. And let's say if they're quite strict about how they express themselves throughout that, there is potential for some difficulties between the children because one is in their intuition and the other one really wants to have that structure and that logical thinking, right? And so they might clash sometimes, just in the way they play, they express themselves, and also how they engage with each other. Because a 7 to 11-year-old in their concrete operational stage might have expectations on the child in the pre-operational stage that younger child cannot fulfill. And that might frustrate that older child. So as a parent, what can we do? Well, we can actually explain that to the child in the concrete operational stage, because they will actually love to have a logical reason for why their younger sibling acts differently. And of course, you will have to find child appropriate language, and you will know best how to do that because you know your child. But just know that they actually love to get information. They love to get an explanation from you that will explain them why their younger sibling might frustrate them at that stage. And then from 12 onwards, we move into the formal operational stage. So here we can now use abstract reasoning about hypothetical events. So we're moving from the concrete events into hypothetical event situations. We can consider logical possibilities, systematically examine tests, and test hypotheses. Now, again, keep in mind that the development of the prefrontal cortex is only completed at around 22 years of age. And again, I'll come back to that a little bit later. Emotional brain development. Okay, so those of you who have toddlers right now or who had toddlers before might remember just thinking, my toddler won't listen to me. What am I going to do? Now, we're going to talk about our background in the situation as parents and caregivers. So often we expect to be heard and obeyed, right? We're the parents at the end of the day. And of course, many situations are just simply unsafe if our child doesn't listen to us. So it is important. And it's not only something that we expect. But do we take things personal sometimes? I can speak for myself, I do, for sure. And what are realistic expectations based on our children's emotional brain development? So now if we're thinking back about the prefrontal cortex and its role about decision making and it's quite late development, you know, what are realistic expectations that we can have? And why is this relevant to the emotional rather than cognitive development? Well, the reason being is because we're getting emotional, right? When we're thinking about it, as you're thinking about it, you might already have some emotional responses coming up. So I just want you to take a moment and consider which behavior that your child displays triggers you, and also why it triggers you. And when we talk about triggers, now triggers are normally events that we don't allow ourselves enough of, us as parents. So we generally get triggered by something that we reject firmly and strongly. However, there's that part in us that might want to actually just base in this trigger. So I'm giving you a sample, again, of my personal experience. One thing that triggers me is being late. So, you know, I'm finding rushing my child in the mornings and it's getting a bit hectic, and I'm sure some of you can relate to that. And it triggers me so much because I don't allow myself to be late. You know, it's something that is very deep innate. It's something that was brought onto me in my childhood as well. It's just very rude and very impolite. So as a practice, I sometimes challenge myself to actually be late and to just let go and to be unapologetic about it as well. And it does help to take the edge out of it, because what I then realize is that nothing bad actually happens. You know, of course, I choose situations where I know nothing bad will actually happen. So just a little intercourse into psychology and how we deal with triggers in speech therapy and psychology. Good. Now, the prefrontal cortex. So before I was talking about the brain stem, now I'm going to talk about the limbic brain. And the limbic brain is basically the continuation of the brain stem. The limbic brain is responsible for fight, flight, freeze, stress responses. All it thinks is, am I safe? Do people want me? Am I loved? This is where our emotions live. And when I say emotions here, I'm talking about the deep, raw, animalistic emotions that just come up and we have very little control. So we are deeply in the subconscious mind here. The prefrontal cortex is the exact opposite. So the 9 functions of the prefrontal cortex are empathy, where we consciously assess other people's emotions, what they're going through. We're linking it to our own experiences inside. Response flexibility, the freedom of choice. I can choose to respond to an event in a certain way. Now, if you think about it, even as adults, we all have our triggers. We're just talking about triggers. Once you are triggered, you are in a stress response. How often do you actually manage to practice response flexibility when you're stressed? Or let me rephrase the question. How often do you find yourself in a situation where you're just being triggered and that trigger just causes you to respond in a certain way, and you're losing your ability to think about your response? I'm sure you can all relate to that. Now, this is what's happening to us as adults with a fully developed prefrontal cortex. So imagine how that looks for little children who don't even have that kind of ability. Emotion regulation, the same thing. You know, am I able to actively regulate my emotions? Children, younger children, are able to practice emotion regulation, but in a slightly different way, and we'll come to that in a second. Body regulation, the same thing. Can I slow down my breathing? Can I slow down my stress, my physiological stress responses in the body. Morality, again, so this is considering, this is actively thinking. Intuition. So the reason why intuition is still in the prefrontal cortex is because here we talk about the intuition that's based on experience and on many different events and on our morals and our value system. Attuned communication and fear modulation. So again, fear modulation goes in line with response flexibility, emotion regulation, and body regulation as well. Okay, so very important. And again, as adults, we are not always in control of the prefrontal cortex. We are in theory, but we've had many, many experiences that have been saved in our subconscious mind. And the subconscious mind, together with the limbic brain, likes to override our decision-making ability and our rational thinking. Again, remember, please write any questions into the Q&A box at any point in time. So we now know that children pretty much don't have a developed prefrontal cortex, right? So their decision-taking is limited, and it's overruled by quite basic thoughts and brain patterns. So imagine your child happily playing. And as in my example, you now come and you want to rush them out of the door. Okay, so your child does not have the ability to fully comprehend the necessity to get out of the door right now at this particular moment, because otherwise you're going to be late for something else, and then this and this and this happens. Yeah, this is only happening in my brain in this case. So in my brain, I'm having this whole cascade of things that's going to happen when we don't get out of the door within the next 2 minutes. In my child's brain, there is, I am happily playing and I am enjoying myself. And I am also fully engaged in this activity. Because when children do something, they do it completely, right? There is no such thing like playing and still being mindful of mommy's emotions over there. No, it's not happening. So one thing that is important is looking at your child, getting your child's attention. If I call my son's name 50 times whilst he's playing, chances are he's not going to hear me because he's busy. His brain is busy, as simple as that. And it's happy on top of that. And now I'm asking him to do something that is not so pleasurable. So that's redirection over command. So instead of me saying, come, put on your shoes, do this, do this, do this, which again is taking him from pleasure into, you know, why would I do that? So what can help is, I'm staying with my example. What can help is saying, you know, let's get into the car, and in the car, you can do this, or we're going to play a song in the car, or we're going to play a game in the car, or you can play with whatever, or you can eat your favorite snack. Something that, you know, is also pleasurable. So at least we're now not just offering an empty command. Saving our no's and stops. There is a place for no's and stops, and that's when danger can occur to your child. But save them, because if you're always saying no, it just, you know, there's no importance to it. So we need to save them, and we should have a specific voice that really tells your child, this is important, and now I need to listen. So that's very helpful. Yeah. Again, when it comes to safety, you know, take a moment, think about what are your no's. When would you like to use them? When should you use them, in your opinion? And again, there's no right or wrong. We just want to be mindful of not overusing them. If possible, don't yell. What happens when we yell? When we yell, we send our child into a stress situation. What happens when our child is stressed? They can't think. They cannot respond. They possibly can't even hear very well. Okay, they're in a complete fight or flight response. It happens with children so much faster than it happens with us adults, simply because of the way their brain is developing. Okay, so keep that in mind. The way you send your child into stress is much faster. You might think, well, that's no reason to stress. That's no reason to cry. That's no reason to be upset. That's no reason to be afraid. And you can explain that to your children, but in a calm and quiet manner, because otherwise they're already stressed. You're trying to explain them something when they're in a state where they can't hear. And listen to your children, allowing them to verbalize what's happening for them. Okay, so nurturing brain development. The three major emotional development stages are the first stage from birth to 1 year, where we notice emotions, then expressing emotions 2 to 3 years, managing emotions 3 to 5 years. So notice how we here have from birth to 1 year, but then from 2 to 3, 3 to 5. And that's because the expressing emotion and the managing emotion stages are really overlapping quite widely, and it really depends on your child where they are. So noticing emotions birth to 1 year. How can we help our children in that stage? Well, remember that first brainstem part wants to feel safe and nurtured. So we create a safe, consistent environment. Having a little bit of consistency and planning can really help the brain to feel safe. When we know, okay, every day at this time, this is happening. With feeding times, for example, this is why routine is important. Imagine the young baby goes from being an embryo and getting nutrients on demand all the time to now having feeding times. And that by itself is causing stress to the infant, because it's something that they haven't learned. And you might remember how infants go into an immediate complete meltdown, stress, when they are hungry, because the sensation of being hungry is something that they don't know. It's something unknown. It's not as if they have the ability to recognize, oh, I'm hungry, I should eat something. And there's a solution to that. It's just stress. That's it. There's no food. Encouraging self-soothing. So we don't want to have our child cry it out. We don't want them to, figure it out by themselves, because they can't do that. But we want to encourage self-soothing by offering different techniques that are age appropriate even to a young child, a very young child. May it be a soft toy, may it be cuddling, may it be rocking motions, may it be a dummy, a pacifier, anything that works into your family system. Showing your emotions, your own emotions. So it's very important throughout all the stages to normalize our own emotions, but to also display them. Because otherwise, if we don't start with that at a very early age, children are suddenly going to be thrown into this full range of emotions that they've never seen, and they suddenly are aware and they can recognize them, but they haven't seen them before. So not being shy to also show what we might consider as negative emotions to infants and very young children is important. Expressing emotions. So here what we can do to help our child's development is to stay calm when they aren't. So what is a temper tantrum? Yeah, we all know the terrible twos, the temper tantrums. What are they? Well, they are expressions of emotions in the only child appropriate way. There is no other way for a child to express the emotions at this age. And it's an overload of emotions as well. So if we take the stress from ourselves as parents and caregivers, because we all know that every child is going through this phase, right? So should we care if we're in the middle of the mall and people are around us and our child is having a temper tantrum? No. And also, every single child will go through temper tantrums in their own way. Meaning, if your child needs to scream for a few minutes before they are able to process information, then so be it. Make sure they are safe whilst they're doing it. Maybe when they're calm and quiet, you can try to offer them different outlets. You know, maybe say the next time you're so angry, maybe try hitting, would you like to try hitting a pillow? Would that help? Or would you like to squeeze teddy bear? Or, you know, would you like me to carry you? Or what would you like to do? And maybe they're able to give you an answer. Maybe they're not, and that's fine as well. You will know. But it's about staying calm, you know, within yourself and just knowing this is absolutely normal and it will pass as well. But it's important that we actually allow these temper tantrums because they're an expression of emotions, and that's what your child needs in this developmental stage. Giving them language to name and explain in a reinforcing manner. Yeah, so I noticed that you were this and this and this. Again, do not talk to your child whilst they're in a temper tantrum. There is no point. They can't hear, they can't absorb, they can't take in what you're saying. Okay, they're not there yet. But then after giving them different words and explain, you know, what just happened. You will have to explain it to them in the beginning, and then they can learn to explain it themselves. They can explain. And that is the best reinforcement and empowerment you can give your child, because they feel powerful. You know, I can actually tell what's happening. And very often in emotion regulation, as well with adults as with children, the moment we are able to name and claim our emotion, they lose a lot of their power over us. And finally, 3 to 5. Now I'm finishing at 5 here because these are the major developmental stages of the emotional development. Okay, so keep in mind, we still have that big part of the prefrontal cortex to come after. Giving them strategies. So I mentioned before that children are absolutely able to practice emotion regulation. It's just in a slightly different way. Remember, we're talking in this age group, which is the second and the third of Piaget's 4 stages. We're talking about intuition being the more ruling, how can I say, the more ruling operator or modus operandum from where your child comes. So giving them strategies here is going to be based on them recognizing their emotions, and they will do that intuitively. Whereas when they are older, so once we have the prefrontal cortex starting to develop, there is a different rational observation that we can bring into play. So we will be able later on to talk more about, why did you feel that way? You know, what made you feel this way? What was happening there for you? At this age, it is important that they recognize their emotions, and because they're able to follow through with small sequences, they will then be able to use their practice emotion regulation strategies. So what do I mean by that? A child gets really unhappy, it's sad, let's say, sadness. Your child can recognize that it is sad. If before you have developed with them a sequence, you know, when you're sad, what you can do, and of course your child will have to have a lot of input in that, what do they want to do? Let's say they want to come and give you a hug. Okay, so the sequence is, I recognize I'm feeling sad, I go to my parent or caregiver and I ask to have a hug, because I know that helps me to not feel sad anymore. So that's having realistic expectations as well. Yeah, again, don't expect your child to be very clear about why they're feeling that well. And we might want to try and rationalize it because we think that it helps our children in a way that, oh, if they understand that there isn't really any reason to be sad and, you know, they're not going to be sad. No, that's too much at that young age. Okay, they don't need to know, they don't need to understand why they're sad. They're sad. That's it. And we as parents and caregivers, we need to acknowledge that they're sad. That's it. You know, we don't want to fix the reason for being sad. We want to fix them being sad. So that's the difference between working with the prefrontal cortex and working without the prefrontal cortex. So we are often having very unrealistic expectations about the way we reason with our children. Yeah, and I'm sure by now you can see how that carries through a lot of areas in our lives. And the last thing we want to do is validate your child's feelings, and that goes in there, right? If I always tell my child there is no reason for you to be upset right now, it makes them feel insecure about the way they're feeling. In all kind of situations, it makes them question if they're having the appropriate response. Their response will always be appropriate. If your child is scared, your child is scared, because the way their brain has developed so far is completely different to ours. There is not that kind of experience that will now tell you this is actually not scary because I know this is it's only on TV, it's only pretend, it's only this and this and this. Yeah, so, and we don't always know when children change in a way. So you will watch your child and you will see when suddenly, things are not scary. And again, every child is completely different. And will develop differently as well. Good. So I put my contact details here. Feel free to take a screenshot or a quick picture. And in case you have any more questions that you want to discuss after the session, please feel free to reach out to me. Now I'm going to have a look into the chat and into the Q&A. So I have nothing here currently. Please feel free to ask any questions that you might have, or give me any comments, any feedbacks, any experiences you would like to share. Okay. Well, if there's no more questions, thank you so much for joining. And I hope I will see you again very soon for the other seminars. Don't forget, we have our more interactive sessions, which are for children themselves and their caregivers, of course. And we have them every Monday in Arabic, Tuesdays in English, and then again Wednesday in Arabic and Thursday in English as well. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day and rest of your weekend.